much for coming along once again. This week's quite a historic week, and we want to spend some time looking at the impact of what's been happening. In particular, we've had an announcement from the American president that the American country's got to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. The Paris Climate Agreement that was reached by 197 countries in December of 2015 and has entered into force is in fact probably the largest international agreement ever concorded and concluded on the face of the earth. And President Trump has decided to withdraw from that treaty, leaving us in the company of only two other countries in the world. Nicaragua, who didn't sign the treaty because they thought it wasn't forceful enough. They wanted to see more. And the state of Syria. We're now in the company of Syria in rejecting the accord. Now, this is pretty staggering in its implications. And if you look at it, as we must, in terms of a global reaction, it's not just the American political scene that we've got to take account of, because this is a global accord. It's a global accord that included a lot of heads of state, all the heads of state from 195 countries, signing on to an agreement of principle and a strategy for working towards the reduction of greenhouse gases. This is not trivial. This is the biggest single achievement in human history, in diplomatic history. And whether we can do it or not is an open question. The willingness to do it was what was established in December 2015 by these numerous countries. I mean, so numerous that it was 195 to 3. So we're going to look now at this whole question of the campaign slogan of America First, which Trump has bandied around and said he's going to pursue as a strategy, and how in fact it makes America last. America last and Americans last in their own environment, here at home in America, but also last in a global sense. So it's entitled America First, in quotes, makes America last. Political leaders, citizens, and scientists are dismayed by U.S. withdrawal from the Global Climate Accord. The explanation of what was going on and what transpired was carried by Fox News, actually. It's pretty extraordinary.
Fox News Sunday host Chris Wallace, who's live in D.C. Chris, do we know any of the backstory about how he arrived at this decision?
Well, I don't know the inside of the last few days. I can tell you, though, there has been a tremendous tug of war. Earlier on, you were showing pictures in the colonnade off the Rose Garden with Reince Priebus, the chief of staff, and Steve Bannon, the chief strategist. This has been a real fight between what I would call the globalists in the administration and the nationalists in the administration. People like Steve Bannon, who very much believe in keeping America first and are kind of against globalization. And then you've got people including Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump, the president's daughter and son-in-law. Also Gary Cohn, the head of the National Economic Council, the president's top economic advisor, all of whom were pushing very hard to stay in the agreement. Everyone agrees that this agreement is not perfect and isn't by itself going to save the economy or the environment. But there are some people, the supporters of the agreement, who believe that it's an important first step. It's the first time you've gotten countries like China and India, major polluters, on board, agreeing to some limits on their carbon emissions. And John Roberts was just talking about, well, we can negotiate another deal. This took years, and 195 nations agreed to it. The chances that they're now going to, because Donald Trump came in, agree to renegotiate it, I think are very slim.
That's an understatement. The chances are zero that this will be renegotiated. Zero. Not just very slim. Then the Europeans are not, they've already gone on record, as you'll hear, saying, no, this is not renegotiable. The President of the United States has made a major mistake. He's withdrawn from the only viable means of addressing diplomatically global climate change. It's a huge, huge mistake. And it's because of the battle that was going on in the White House, as we heard, between the domestic advisors versus the internationalists or the global sympathizers. Among them was actually the Secretary of State, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, was trying to lobby the president to stay into the accord. This is irony of irony. Former head of CEO of ExxonMobil, Secretary of State for the United States, could not prevail upon his own president to stay in the climate accord.
And in fact, interestingly enough, President Xi of China just talked with Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, and talked about how they have to work together to defend this agreement. And I think a lot of people and a lot of national security people are going to say this is going to create a national security void, a leadership void, and you're going to see countries like China and our European allies that aren't quite so friendly as they were after last week, banding together against the White House and against this president when it comes to climate change.
Well, one of the reasons why they're not so friendly as they were, as we saw just last week, was that in addition to the climate faux pas that the president has made here, he managed to alienate every one of the members of NATO by saying he wasn't going to respond to Chapter 7 or Article 7 of the NATO Accord, which obliges countries to come to one another's defense. And it's on that chapter that America has, in effect, gotten NATO to back its activities in Afghanistan. And he's saying we're not going to abide by that anymore, or it's questionable, if we will. We're going to assess it on a case-by-case basis. This outraged all of the European leaders. And just 2 days later, there was a G7 meeting when he proceeded to insult a series of further global leaders. The staggering collapse of his foreign posture in a 2-week period, culminating in this, is really quite exceptional. Never before in human history has a state gone from such leadership role to a complete followership role, to such an extent that heads of state elsewhere are making their point of views known.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Lakshmi Singh. Much of Europe is reacting in consternation to President Trump's decision to withdraw the U.S. from the Global Climate Accord. NPR's Eleanor Beardsley reports France, Italy, and Germany immediately reaffirmed their commitment to the agreement to reduce global warming.
Though President Trump's announcement was not unexpected, it still stunned many across Europe. Yannick Jadot is the spokesman for the Ecology Party in the European Parliament. He said Trump's reasoning was astounding.
His decision, it's full of lies, of post-factual figures, and it's a kind of the U.S. are moving away from their international responsibility.
Jadot says he hopes Europe's reaction will be strong and that it will take up leadership on the climate pact. French President Emmanuel Macron says he'll meet with German Chancellor Angela Merkel in the coming days to reinforce their country's common actions. Macron says there is no plan B for the planet. Eleanor Beardsley, NPR News, Paris.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Jack Spear. U.S. allies have been expressing alarm over President Trump's decision to pull out of the Paris Climate Accord. But Secretary of State Rex Tillerson argues the U.S. will continue to reduce emissions. NPR's Michelle Kellerman has more.
European governments have made clear they won't be renegotiating the Paris Climate Accord. Only Syria and Nicaragua are not part of it. But Secretary Tillerson, a former ExxonMobil CEO, is playing down concerns that the U.S. is isolated on this. He says America has a, quote, terrific record of reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
That was done in the absence of a Paris Agreement. I don't think we're going to change our ongoing efforts to reduce those emissions in the future either, so hopefully people can keep it in perspective.
Tillerson was speaking alongside Brazil's foreign minister a day after President Trump announced that the U.S. will stop implementing the non-binding accord. Michelle Kellerman, NPR News, the State Department.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Shay Stevens. President Trump's decision to withdraw U.S. participation in the landmark Paris climate deal is still drawing reaction, as Phil Latzman reports from member station KJZZ in Phoenix. One of the authors of the deal says efforts to renegotiate it may be fruitless.
Arizona State University law professor Daniel Badansky is an environmental law expert who helped write the agreement and was in Paris when it was signed 18 months ago. While President Trump has said he wants to renegotiate the pact, Badansky believes that doesn't deal with the real issue.
I think the problem for the Trump administration is if you don't believe in climate change, then you don't necessarily think you should have a Paris Agreement, and nothing in a new agreement is going to change that basic reality.
Badansky says staying in the agreement and being obstructionist could have been even more harmful than exiting it, and that many nations around the world may take a wait-and-see approach to see if the U.S. re-enters the agreement at a later date or under a new administration. For NPR News, I'm Phil Latzman in Phoenix.
Now, how do you like that? Or under a new administration. We have now, in a sense, the world community waiting for Trump to get out of office. They may wait and see if the United States reverses its opinion or if there's an election and they can get rid of him. This is an extraordinary position in which to place the whole United States, but especially to put President Trump. Now the eyes of the world are on the importance of every American election. This is going to be extraordinary, especially since we've learned a lot about how these elections may well be rigged by foreign powers, like the Russians. Well, as I say, world leaders from all over the place, the head of the Koichi Yamamoto of Japan's environment minister came out strongly saying, look, this is silly. And Malcolm Turnbull, the Australian Prime Minister, came out as well, a big coal country, in a sense, a coal exporting country. Canada, where all the tar sands are located, came out saying it was disastrous. Just listen to one after another. It's staggering.
18 months ago in Paris, there were cheers and tears of joy. There seemed near universal optimism. The world had united behind a global agreement. On Friday, world leaders spoke of a different common sentiment: disappointment.
I do respect this decision, but I do think it is an actual mistake, both for the US and for our planet.
I believe the US President Trump decision completely goes against the wisdom that mankind has developed, so I am deeply disappointed.
It is disappointing. We would prefer the United States to remain part of the agreement.
Canada is deeply disappointed with the US position. The Paris Agreement is a good deal for Canada, and it's a good deal for the world.
In Pacific Island nations, homes regularly flood because of climate change. Fiji's Prime Minister was another to say that Donald Trump's decision was deeply disappointing, especially for vulnerable nations.
So this is a geopolitical issue for America as well as an environmental one. Now, these are countries that are at the forefront of the climate impacts. The rising sea levels are threatening their very existence. And if they feel like they're being thrown under the bus by the Trump administration, they may well turn into the willing embrace of China that wants to expand its influence here.
The United States now joins just two other countries not part of the accord: Nicaragua and Syria. And so far, no other country has suggested it will pull out of Paris too. But environmentalists worry President Trump's decision will lessen their resolve to stick to the spirit of the agreement, as well as their formal commitments. Here in Australia, for example, the government has recently approved a giant new coal mine. Its coal will be mostly exported and burned in China and India, so it won't add much to Australia's emissions, but it will do just as much global damage. One irony is that the Great Barrier Reef, very near the approved new mine, will be one natural wonder to suffer. Over the last 2 years, warming seas have already bleached half the reef of its colour. More warming will make that worse.
Well, you can see why people are listening to Trump, because it's affecting the habitats around the world.
President Trump promises to make America great again. But in France, where the nationalist view lost out to a more global outlook in recent elections, the new president had this to say.
Because wherever we live, whoever we are, we all share the same responsibility. Make our planet great again.
Andrew Thomas, Al Jazeera, Sydney.
Now you got to realize that is one heck of a powerful statement. Heads of state in other cultures altogether are learning English and making a direct appeal to the American people in English, because they realize that we don't speak their languages. In English they're speaking to us, saying, look, we need to make the world, the globe, the planet great again. Not the cronies of the oil companies and the little set of elites that Trump depends upon for his power. Al Gore, of course, was quite critical.
This is a reckless and indefensible move. It undermines the standing of our country and threatens the ability of humanity to solve the climate crisis in time. But make no mistake about it, if President Trump will not lead this struggle, the American people will. CEOs, civic leaders, mayors, governors, average citizens. We're in the middle of a clean energy revolution now that is unstoppable. We are going to solve the climate crisis no matter what President Trump does.
Well, that's the kind of characteristic optimism of political figures. But it was so staggering that, of course, the news media spent a lot of time on it this last week.
We zero in now on the big story of this day, the president's decision to withdraw from a global accord aimed at slowing the impact of climate change. We explore the consequences of all this and how it may play out in coming years in the United States and around the world.
And around the world as well. But she starts off with Governor Jerry Brown. Take a look.
We begin with California Governor Jerry Brown, a Democrat. His state is battling efforts by the Trump administration to roll back some emissions regulations, and he's flying to China tomorrow to discuss what more can be done on climate change. I spoke with him just a short time ago. Governor Jerry Brown, thank you for joining us. Your office put out a statement a short time ago saying this is an insane course of action. Do you mean that?
I certainly do mean that. If anything, it's understated. Climate change is an existential threat to all of humanity, to the natural systems on which all life depends. Not tomorrow, but starting very quickly, we're seeing changes. California has lost 100 million trees from the drought. Sea level is rising. The Antarctica is seeing ice melting at an ever rapid rate, some say in an irreversible way. This is a profoundly serious problem. The Paris Agreement was an agreement of nations saying what they could do voluntarily. Here is the commitment. President Obama made something I thought was doable, was reasonable. In fact, California is doing that very thing now, and our economy has grown in terms of GDP 40% faster than the nation as a whole. We've created over 2 million jobs. So climate action and jobs go together. So that's why I say this move by Trump makes no sense, and it's going to hurt America, and it's going to cost jobs, not the reverse.
Well, as you know, he makes a different argument. He says this, he said, I'm in favor of doing something to help the environment, but he said this accord is going to cost millions of jobs and cost the American people trillions in lost economic output.
That's a lie. That is completely unwarranted.
That's a lie. Completely unwarranted. Oh, boy, I mean, they're just so angry and so clear about how Trump is dead wrong in this. Schwarzenegger's been making this
President Trump says he's pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. My message to you, Mr. President, is that as a public servant, and especially as a president, your first and most important responsibility is to protect the people. 200,000 people die every year in the U.S. from air pollution, and that half of our rivers and streams are too polluted for our health. We can't sit back and just do nothing while people are getting sick and dying, especially when you know there's another way. So please, Mr. President, choose the future. You see?
Choose the future. The messages are hot and heavy. Elon Musk says he'll leave the White House councils if the U.S. leaves the Paris Accord. Well, they did leave the Paris Accord, and Elon Musk is going to leave the councils that he's been on with the president. Around the world, the president of the largest English-speaking country in the world, India, has vowed to go beyond the Paris Accord, not to be limited by it in a sense. And of course in China, there's been a very clear case of U.S. stepping back. China is going to move forward. Very clear.
Well, obviously, all of us in the environmental community, WWF included, are quite disappointed about the announcement, although we see it coming. But more than just disappointment, I think this is also a call for action. This is a moment in history where countries and business and mayors and concerned public should stand together, more united than ever.
Okay. Countries, mayors of cities, even NGOs and companies. In South Africa, the reaction before the decision was announced was very interesting.
Kumi Naidoo in Johannesburg, South Africa, the response to if the rumors are true that Trump plans to pull the U.S. out of the climate accord. What has been the response there? We just heard what happened in Brussels, Belgium, with the booing as they heard this news.
Well, there's a sense of unreality, and even as we sit now, 6 hours before he's about to give his press conference to take a final position on the Paris Agreement, even right now, to be honest, we cannot believe that the United States government will act against the interests of its own people and the interests of people across the world. And for us in Africa, where our continent has a very low level of responsibility in terms of accumulated emissions historically, and we are already paying the first and most brutal price, there is a deep sense of not just shock, but a sense of unreality that the United States under Bush held us back by 8 years, and now we are going back. And people need to bear in mind that the Paris Climate Agreement is far from a perfect agreement.
Far from a perfect one, but at least was getting us on the right road, as he points out. Here in the States, scientists like Michael Mann came to speak out. In fact, several states have started to group together independently of the nation-state government, that is the U.S. government, since that's under Trump's control at this point, and create their own organizations to address climate change. Listen to the headline.
The governors of California, New York, and Washington State are forming the group, the United States Climate Alliance. They say they'll work to see their states meet targets set out in the Paris Climate Accord, even though President Trump is moving to pull the U.S. out of it. The governors are urging other states to join them.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see if they do. Kerry was very clear.
Well, Scott Pruitt is an extremist, and he is an extremist who believes there is no climate change. He's one of the people who is a denier.
He's talking about Scott Pruitt, now the head of EPA under Trump.
He believes it's a hoax. He came into office to undo specifically the progress that the country is making. It is really a stark example of the craven cynicism with which the president has approached this issue.
As he says, Kerry, Trump's decision puts nation last. And this is in effect what happens. Political leaders, citizen scientists are dismayed by U.S. withdrawal from the Global Climate Accord. The international community has made it clear. Scientists, journalists, and activists have made their positions clear. Kerry has come out and said it's self-destructive and puts the U.S. last, not first. And of course, we see a witness of this as China steps forward and the U.S. steps back. In effect, America first, as a slogan and a policy, has been making America last in this case. We urgently need a new kind of citizen science alliance around the world to work together to devise a transition to a sustainable future.
Chomsky. You're watching Cambridge Community TV.